gentlemen. It's Eva Kaili. I'm the chair of STOA and the Center for Artificial Intelligence. I'm actually very honored to open this annual lecture, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the panel for the future of science and technology, STOA, to the 2020 edition of our lecture. I think it's a very timely and special event during a pandemic that actually accelerated the transition to a digital era, that we can now discuss the lessons and also the realizations of the shortcomings we had, and also translate human rights in the digital era and discuss about the future of democracy. These are discussions that we started several years ago, so I had the foresight to enter this discussion. But at this point, I think we have more and more interest into this transition and transformation that we're all experiencing. And I would like to thank our participants for accepting this invitation, and also the STOA Secretariat and the STOA team for, under these extraordinary circumstances, making it possible to have this event. I really believe that STOA for over 30 years has managed to set a trademark within the European Parliament for debates that bring together MEPs from different committees to reflect the role of science and technology, and also excellent scientists that we can discuss with them, Nobel Prize winners, how we can prepare for the future and have scientific data to base our legislation. So STOA has been a pioneer in the field of the social and ethical aspects of new and emerging technologies, with a special focus on transformative technologies. And since 2016, actually, I believe a bit before the Commission this time, we managed to highlight and promote the need of algorithmic accountability and transparency, and the regulatory control of online platforms through studies, depth analysis, and public events. Recently, we launched the Center for Artificial Intelligence to provide expertise on the possibilities and limitations of AI and its implications, of course, as ethical, legal, economic, and societal perspectives might have. In the same time, we are setting this center to collaborate with the OECD, IEEE, ILO, global organizations to achieve and agree in common standards and rules. I think actually we were responding to the call of Shoshana Zhubov, saying that now it's a wake-up time for us to policy make and properly prepare for the future. So we are also trying to raise public awareness through this annual lecture. And we are featuring eminent speakers, and we talk about now a topic that is at the highest of our political agenda. So the subject of this year's annual lecture is digital human rights and the future of democracy, lessons from the pandemic. And we'll focus on the disruptive effects of the digital revolution upon democracy and the protection of civil liberties and human rights in the context of the current pandemic. We will examine our ability, or what can we do to remain in control of our choices and data, the challenges of datafication and platformization of our societies, and the need of data sovereignty. How can we achieve, of course, this sovereignty in the era of AI, and address the socio-ethical challenges of digitization? The accelerating commodification of personal data that's used for the design, training, and validation of predictive algorithms, and the extensive use of highly targeted behavioral modification techniques have become a new source of legal and ethical concerns. I would mention Cambridge Analytica as an example, but some of us using social media more and more, I think we had an understanding of how our personalized newsfeed could alter our perception. And through the construction of digital infrastructures that track, monitor, and collect personal data at scale, major online platforms, applications, and companies are actually controlling huge data flows and treat technology and technology users as data suppliers via the imposition of default choice architectures. In fact, given that our decisions are influenced actually by powerful algorithms, we would name it the threat of algocracy, the rule by the algorithm. It actually challenges also the rule of law and it challenges the role of human control, privacy, and even democracy in many ways. So there are concerns that this increasing digitalization may lead to augmented surveillance, massive digital dependence, and high epistemic asymmetries. Coronavirus has been the first pandemic of this algorithmic age, and it's exposing the pathologies in the data governance ecosystem, which has left unaccountable private actors in possession of both our data and the means to extract economic value of it. So we still lack necessary mechanisms and methodologies. That's why you're all here. We are trying to be sure we can assess the impact of algorithmic systems with automated data analytics and machine learning capacities and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms. So the current form of computational governance, it has largely remained unregulated. We have lack of oversight, and there is also a huge accountability gap concerning algorithmic processes used on online platforms. So in the absence of these common legal rules and binding legal standards, because we do have actually ethical frameworks, in this absence, the growing datafication of our societies, it seems to threaten and dismantle the fundamentals of our democracy. So we definitely need also connected, address, or to authentically consent to market-based approaches, measures, and practices of the tech sector. And need I mention superintelligence that will become difficult for human control, and I think it will actually reduce human autonomy, is something for which we have to be proactive. So we need actually now trust and quality to avoid losing this autonomy, and the best person to open this this lecture would be, of course, our Vice President, to protect and promote our way of life. I actually am not scared of the word protect. I'm afraid of protectionism. And we have to make sure we will avoid exclusion, discrimination, and inequalities. And of course, we will promote emotional intelligence, creativity, and humanity in our systems. So the questions that arise are, should we build data infrastructures that recognize the role of data as a public good? And can we have an impartial system of data governance? Should we perhaps rethink how we can give options and choices to citizens, and to make sure they're really aware of how we collect their data and the process of their behavioral data? Because of course it's charming and it's helpful and convenient to have personalization, but we need to ensure that there will be a trusted environment by design that the companies will follow. And for this, we need to agree in a level beyond EU. So to tackle these questions and come up with novel, innovative responses, I believe we have the best with us today. We have to understand actually the work of Zsuzsanna Zhukov, one of the most influential thinkers of our times, and her later masterwork, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism and the Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power. I would say it's apocalyptic. It reveals a world where technology users are actually data generators and losing slowly control. And online micro-targeting and behavioral advertising are practices that are out of regulatory control. So her participation is actually a wake-up call for policymakers, and it highlights our obligation to future generations. I will give the floor to our Vice President, and I think since he's Greek and really experienced a very, I would say his identity as a European and a Greek, they are at the same level. He's been like several years now in the European Commission and has a lot of experience. And of course, as a Greek, he loves philosophy and democracy and protecting democracy, and understands how quality for Europe is essential. So I would give him the floor for the introductory speech of this annual lecture, and I want to thank him and say that we actually have a lot of expectations of him, because he's covering social rights, skills, education, security. I think these are the most important sectors that we now have to prepare for. So, Margarita Skinas, Vice President, thank you for the honor of joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Many thanks to the European Parliament for this honor and the pleasure to kickstart the discussion ahead of the keynote address by Professor Zubov. Allow me also to salute my global compatriot Eva Kaili for her remarkable work in putting at the forefront of the EU thinking these very important questions. Of course, I'm not discovering the wheel when I say that there is no better moment to discuss these issues, not only because the pandemic was a great accelerator of all things digital, from elementary school kids to grannies. Everyone came to found his way into the digital world. But also, I think this discussion is very timely because we at the European Commission, we are about in around these weeks to define the European Union's overall approach to the digital transformation. Our job is mainly to make sure that Europe meets the demands of digitization. But I want to be very clear from the start. For us, it is equally important that this not only serves money markets or businesses. This is for us equally important that we fit digitization into our European values and our European way of life, not the other way around. The European way about digital transformation will have to enhance democratic values, to respect fundamental rights, to contribute to a sustainable climate neutral economy. It will have to make sure that our citizens are safe and secure online, as well as their data. It opens, in our mind, this digital transformation the European way would have to open more opportunities than it closes. This is our vision. And let me take you very quickly, because we all want to listen to Professor Zubov. Let me first take you into the three main pillars of this European way of digitalization. Let me start first with values and democratic processes. We here in Europe are very proud that to see that we have managed to develop a human-centric approach to digital technologies. Through our work on privacy and data protection, the General Data Protection Regulation, these are the cornerstones in the EU's array of tools to ensure that this fundamental right is respected, be it private or public sector entities, offline or online. The General Data Protection Regulation and the quest for privacy is paramount. This also encompasses our efforts to promote Europe as a place to develop and deploy trustworthy artificial intelligence. We already have a large body of rules aimed at protecting fundamental rights that are relevant for artificial intelligence, but black box AI applications can be opaque, can be complex, and it can be difficult to find out if an application is used in a legal way when you don't even understand how it works. So for us, algorithms will not have to be in the hands of the engineers. Humans will always have to be at the end of the artificial intelligence chain. We are now working on documentation, testing, and accountability requirements to precisely help all those who deploy artificial intelligence systems to comply and make enforcing laws more effective. The targeted legislation on AI is, of course, part of a wider set of initiatives aimed at making the EU a leader in a data-driven society. Our aim is to create a single market for data that will allow it to flow freely within the EU and across sectors to the benefit of everybody. And in parallel to that, we seek to shield our democracies from new threats that have emerged in the digital environment and that the pandemic has accelerated considerably. Here, we are building our defenses against the spread of disinformation, polarization, hate speech, conspiracy theories, especially online. We have developed 10 days ago a comprehensive European democracy action plan precisely to allow us to build more resilient democratic systems, less vulnerable to foreign interference, and better prepared for the future. And it goes without saying that in doing so, we will not compromise in our commitment to uphold the freedom of expression and people's right to access legal content. Let me now quickly come to the second element of our approach, which I like to call the Europe that protects. We have developed a very effective EU security union strategy, which is precisely the main ecosystem, the main habitat to counter specific threats, both online and offline. To be very clear, my main objective is to align completely the level of protection our citizens and societies would benefit in the digital and in the physical world. Linked to that, we are also accelerating our work on facing a wide range of hybrid threats through the weaponization of data, and we are constructing a European response that is in full alignment with our values and avoids the pitfalls of augmented surveillance in the digital age. Finally, I wouldn't like to forget to omit the third element of this European approach, which is how we can make our digital transformation a true driver for prosperity, inclusion, social cohesion, and resilience. The most crucial investment we have to make in Europe is not in technologies or infrastructures, but in people. We need to bring about a major skills revolution in Europe, one that would allow us to upskill and reskill Europeans who have been clearly left out of the adjustment, of the digital adjustment effort. And we have presented an action plan on inclusion and integration, and we are determined to make everything possible to facilitate the integration of migrants or EU citizens with a migrant background in this new quest for digital skills. Let me conclude by saying that as our economies and societies, and frankly our lives, become increasingly digital, charting a course for digital transformation that is genuinely European, one that does not imitate any other of the existing models, it is not just a matter of competitiveness. It is an existential matter and is essentially about democracy. We do have a clear vision and we do have the means to implement. But as I have just outlined, we are confident that we can put in place a model which is anthropocentric, but at the same time able to keep up with technological change. A model that refuses to reduce Europeans to mere data suppliers to others. A model that acknowledges, protects, and truly empowers them as digital citizens. Many thanks for having me.
Thank you, Vice President. As I said, you have increased our expectations, and I would really like to thank you for honoring us today. I hope you can stay as long as you wish to follow the speech, but of course I know you're also busy to follow also the debate. And I would like now to say and add that Today's event is also dedicated to the memory of the first head of the STOA Secretariat, who was an exceptional mind and a devoted pro-European, Richard Holdsworth. And he was the first one to help UK join the EU and set up the Science and Technology Office at the European Parliament, a real institutional novelty that set the ground for today's STOA. And his legacy will live on forever, and he's been honored by the Secretariat too. So Mr. Hinasa, I want to thank you, and I'm giving now the floor to Professor Zubov of Harvard Business School, a world-class thinker whose research is focused on the contested digital transition, its relationship to the future of capitalism, and the consequences for individuals and society. I would say her books are impressive, so is her career. She's one of the first, maybe I think the first woman to get into the Harvard Business School. I'm just the first woman chairing STOA, but I understand I cannot have a comparison, but like small steps like this so that you can open the path ahead, and you have the foresight to lead people to the future, and be a role model also for us. And I have read your books and your interviews, and they're really inspiring. And I said again, it's a wake-up call for all of us, and I believe we are responding to your call. I have already an invitation for you to join our international advisory board with 25 personalities worldwide influence, in order to be able to collaborate with the biggest organizations and set the rules and the regulations before it's too late. And hopefully we will have the Vice President with us to support this effort for common standards and rules. Ms. Zubov, Professor Zubov, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Eva. It's such a grand honor to be here. I want to express my gratitude to the organizers of the 2020 STOA Annual Lecture. This invitation just means so much to me to be able to speak at this very special event. And of course, I want to thank the members of the panel for the future of science and technology of the European Parliament, and especially you, Eva Kaili. Your work in the field of responsible innovation and the governance of AI is a shining beacon for all of us working on the challenges of the democratic digital future. And I salute you and I thank you. We have a lot to talk about. You know, just last week, I was in a gathering of professionals who should know better, and one man intoned the cliche, I know you've heard it, data is the new oil. And he said it as a defense of the tech companies, their ability to continue in their freedom from the democratic rule of law, which is in fact the freedom to assign their own laws. I believed that we had put this notion of data and oil behind us, but apparently not. So once and for all, I would like to clarify this kind of statement. It is true that data is the new oil, and it is this singular fact that anticipates a new genus of threat. Oil was extracted from the earth, and in the absence of public comprehension and law, its uncontrolled use plunged the earth into irreversible peril, along with everything that we cherish. Data is extracted from humanity, and again, in the absence of public comprehension and law, its uncontrolled use promises to plunge humanity into irreversible peril, and with it, everything that we cherish, including democracy and the many-century cycle of triumph, reversal, and triumph that marks the slow, messy, sacrosanct journey toward more truly democratic conditions of existence. In the case of fossil fuels, our nemesis was never oil itself, but the extractors, the corporate institutions that denied reality, concealed their own scientist research, and place the defense of their narrow economic self-interest above the interests of the earth and all its teeming life, above your family and mine, above all bonds of community, society, civilization, and species. Similarly, today, our nemesis is not and could never be mere data or technology, but rather the extractors, led by a handful of giant corporations, Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, to name only the largest, along with their complex, far-reaching ecosystems. These are corporate institutions that have pioneered a new logic of extraction, but with a dark and startling twist. These extractors target human nature as their virgin forest or unblemished mountainside, unilaterally claiming private human experience for raw material bent to the purposes of datafication, computational production, and sales. I have called these economics surveillance capitalism because they depend upon hidden extraction mechanisms that operate outside human awareness, designed as inscrutable, and relying on the social relations of the one-way mirror to rob us of the right to combat. These corporations have placed the defense of their narrow economic self-interest above the interests of individual sovereignty, democracy, and humanity itself. I am here with you today because the European Union represents humanity's best hope to alter this course before lawless, unprecedented computational concentrations of knowledge and power become as irreversible and poisonous to our societies as the toxic concentrations of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere have become to our Earth. The idea that we could bequeath both of these cataclysms to our children is intolerable, my friends. And to underscore this moral line in the sand, I dedicate this lecture to Iasonos Kritikos, who at the age of 7 developed his impressive understanding of surveillance capitalism for an important school project. We shall return to Iasonos later. Right now, I want to talk to you about what I call surveillance exceptionalism. You know, the surveillance capitalists would have us believe the naturalistic fallacy, that their success is evidence of their rightness and their goodness, when in fact, their success is evidence of a convergence of historical windfalls that allowed them to root and flourish outside the rule of law. Chief among these surprise conditions was the tragedy of 9/11. In the United States, a majority of the Federal Trade Commission had already concluded that the young internet companies' determination to track and monitor their unsuspecting users could not and would not be controlled by self-regulation. And they began to outline comprehensive privacy legislation. But in the days and months following the September attacks, the US Congress abruptly turned from a debate about federal privacy law to a preoccupation with connecting the dots, or what became known as total information awareness. Under these new conditions of novel surveillance practices, the young companies were enabled and encouraged to grow and elaborate these new practices rather than seeing them extinguished. Legal scholars acknowledge this perplexing new public-private symbiosis, explaining that while the US Constitution inhibits surveillance by government actors, there were few, if any, privacy protections for information held in private servers. So the intelligence community would have to, quote, rely on private enterprise to collect and generate information for it, end quote, free of constitutional, legal, and regulatory constraints. By early 2013, the chief technology officer of the CIA, publicly explained this intelligence challenge. He said, quote, "Since you can't connect dots that you don't have, it drives us into a mode of fundamentally trying to collect everything and hang on to it forever. And that challenge would be met by the private internet companies." As he thanked in his remarks Google, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, the telcos, and all the rest for providing all the dots. This unwritten doctrine, which I've called surveillance exceptionalism, essentially granted the fledgling companies a license to steal human experience and render it as proprietary data. So let's talk about surveillance capitalism as a revolutionary institution. This license to steal was a primary driver of digitalization, fast forwarding us into an information civilization. It's hard to actually grasp this, but in 1986, which for me feels like 5 minutes ago, only 1% of the world's information was stored digitally, and still only 25% in the year 2000. By 2007, digitalization storage had jumped to 97%, and by now the structural upheaval is considered complete. And interesting, within that interlude, Google began to discover and elaborate surveillance capitalism between 2000 and 2001, right in the middle of that span of time. With so much information available, friends, democracies should be flourishing. Why is the opposite true? I have spent exactly 42 years of my life studying the rise of the digital as an economic force. Over the course of the last 2 decades, surveillance capitalism engineered a fundamentally anti-democratic epistemic coup, marked by unprecedented concentrations of knowledge about people and the unaccountable power that accrues to such knowledge. This coup proceeds in 3 stages. First, the sharp rise in epistemic inequality. Second, the spread of epistemic chaos. And third, the institutionalization of epistemic dominance. Inequality, chaos, dominance. We are in the midst of stage 2 right now, and the contours of stage 3 are already in sight. To grasp this coup, I want to convey a brief sense of surveillance capitalism as a revolutionary institution. It is basic, but worth emphasizing that surveillance capitalism is not technology. It's not a corporation. It's an institution. And that means it's governed by its laws and imperatives. But because its raw material is the world of humanity, its effects cannot be confined to the economic domain. Surveillance capitalism's foundational mechanisms and economic imperatives constitute a new iron cage that imposes economic order on the digital milieu, but also competes with democracy over the axial principles and moral content of our social order. My friends, this is the contest for the soul of our information civilization. Surveillance capitalism begins with the secret unilateral extraction of behavioral data from private human experience. Only a fraction of what we knowingly give is what they actually take. Operations are geared toward harvesting predictive behavioral signals, the stoop of your shoulders, exclamation points, micro expressions, most of which exist outside of our awareness and therefore beyond our choice to give or conceal. Data are redefined as proprietary and piped through complex supply chains to computational factories called artificial intelligence or machine learning, where they are analyzed and manufactured into predictions of human behavior. Facebook's AI hub is described as ingesting trillions of data points each day and producing 6 million behavioral predictions each second. Ultimately, these prediction products are sold to business customers in a new kind of marketplace that trades exclusively in human futures. These markets began with targeted online ads, but now comprise many forms of exchange far from those roots. Surveillance economics were invented at Google, migrated quickly to Facebook, and have become essential to the growth of the other giants, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple. These days, hardly any industry is exempt, as surveillance capitalism travels through the normal economy in sectors like education, health, insurance, real estate, retail, finance, every product that begins with the word smart, every service that begins with the word personalized, they are all on this train. Extraction is pursued for the sake of certainty. Surveillance capitalists compete in the sale of certainty. And it is these competitive dynamics that define the imperatives which shape extraction and compel corporate behavior. The first is that great predictions require a lot of data, economies of scale. Certainty requires volume, but also variety, economies of scope. So these also drive extraction operations through every domain of life. So here we see the first stage of the epistemic coup. The license to steal at scale and scope produces a wholly new axis of social inequality, epistemic inequality. This is defined as the growing gap between what I can know and what can be known about me. It is institutionalized in unprecedented concentrations, not just of economic power, but of knowledge itself and of the power that accrues to such knowledge. Citizens of democratic societies have been turned into bystanders as surveillance capitalism builds its knowledge empires from our lives. Now let's turn to stage 2. Such are the compulsions of scale and scope that extraction cannot decline a single morsel. It proceeds with the discipline of the one-eyed cyclops, voraciously consuming all it can see and radically indifferent to everything that eludes its line of sight. It devours behavior without meaning, signal without content, equality without equivalence. There is no big other here that demands to engineer your soul. There is only a machine world, a big other that simply wants to extract its signals. Epistemic inequality and radical indifference thus create the conditions that produce epistemic chaos. Facebook executive Andy Bosworth once explained this radical indifference in which epistemic chaos thrives. He said, quote, "We connect people. That can be a good thing if they make it positive. Maybe they find someone to fall in love with. That can be a bad thing if they make it negative. Maybe someone dies in a terrorist attack. The ugly truth is that anything that allows us to connect more people more often is de facto good. These are the growth tactics that have gotten us where we are." So, the drive for scale and scope is the cause of algorithmic tuning to maximize connection, attention, engagement. But please remember, these are not ends in themselves. There is no attention economy. These are effects of a deeper cause, and that cause is surveillance capitalism's economic imperatives. These corporations are not publishers, they are not distributors, they are not merely ad tech providers, they are indiscriminate, radically indifferent, all-you-can-eat extractors of everything forever, all for the sake of predictions that become more lucrative as they approach certainty. So we are continuously dismayed that they take so little responsibility for the content they display. But from their point of view, from the point of view of the machine systems that execute these imperatives, the most rancid or violent content is simply data points, dots waiting for connection to produce 6 million predictions each second. For a data extractor to discard data points is like asking a coal mining operation to voluntarily set aside containers of loose coal because it happens to be too dirty. It violates the fundamental logic of the operation. That's why content moderation is always a last resort and therefore so frustrating to the public and to lawmakers alike. It is undertaken only to maintain data flows, which is to say, either to minimize the risk of user withdrawal or to avoid political sanctions that might threaten the license to steal. Content moderation sits at the margins of these companies, an accessory, a public relations necessity. You can think of it as something like ExxonMobil's Office of Social Responsibility. The world is held hostage in this iron cage as epistemic chaos is unleashed in every direction. We are as deer in the headlights, paralyzed, relegated to supplication. Please, sir, please, Mr. Zuckerberg, please, Mr. Google, stop this disinformation, stop this misinformation, please stop this hate speech, these incitements to violence, please. Which brings us to stage 3 of the epistemic coup, the most significant phase of surveillance capitalism's development, how knowledge begets the power to achieve epistemic dominance. Knowledge about people at this unprecedented scale produces a new kind of power over people. This is what data scientists call the shift from monitoring to actuation, where there are actually sufficient data about a machine system to be able to control it remotely. The thing is now it's not just the machine systems, it's the human system. So the depth of knowledge about us yields new methods of behavioral modification that work through the digital architecture with a range of targeting mechanisms, including subliminal cues, engineered social comparison dynamics, psychological micro-targeting, real-time rewards and punishments, gamification. Over the course of the last several years, we've learned how easily these institutional mechanisms of surveillance capitalism can be pivoted from commercial to political objectives. Epistemic inequality, chaos, and dominance have been essential to the startling rise of autocracy around the world, especially over the last decade, as these capabilities were developed and perfected. The cases of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and the forensics of the Trump 2016 campaign have showed us that anyone with enough money, know-how, and determination can tap into surveillance capitalism's troves of human-generated information, its methods of analysis, its targeting mechanisms. For example, the 2016 Trump campaign appears to simply have exploited the full machinery of Facebook's targeting mechanisms. Its whole enterprise offered to advertisers, the subliminal cues, the micro-targeting, the social comparison, all of it, to effectively persuade a significant plurality of Black citizens of our democratic society in the United States to refrain from voting. And they did this, my friends, without a single gun or threat of torture. In other words, unequal knowledge produces unequal power, defined as the growing gap between what I can do and what can be done to me. These interventionist mechanisms constitute a new field of capabilities that I have called economies of action, remote behavioral modification at scale, guided by algorithmic parameters to tune and herd behavior toward someone else's objectives. Economies of action produce a new kind of totalizing power that requires no jackbooted soldiers, no weapons, no threats of terror or murder. I call it instrumentarian power because it comes to us lightly, invisible, or at least indecipherable, working its will through the medium of digital instrumentation. Instrumentarian power paves the way to the fulfillment of the coup, epistemic dominance. Now, I want us to talk about the pandemic because the pandemic has become the canvas against which this epistemic coup in all of its stages has been illustrated in sharp relief. And so there's an opportunity for us to see it in real time, as it were, as it marks these last months of illness and death and economic misery that we have shared in our communities, our families, and our countries. The new iron cage has revealed just how vulnerable our democracies are to the effects of the epistemic coup. First of all, when we think about the stages of the pandemic, the first and most obvious effect has been the growth of surveillance revenues, and with it, the growth and elaboration of the first stage of the epistemic coup, which is to say epistemic inequality. As more people in more places are finding themselves wholly dependent upon remote services, largely controlled by the institutions of surveillance capitalism, whether we're talking about schooling, telehealth, e-commerce, social media, or all the meetings that we're all having all the time to get our work done, epistemic inequality is on the rise. Secondly, in the United States, the pandemic was intentionally politicized by Trump and a right-wing ecosystem simply by exploiting the mechanisms that produce epistemic chaos in social media. Now, there is a great deal of research on this, and I would love to be able to share so much of it with you. I'm going to cite just one very, very good study that was conducted by Avaz, published in August, and it exposed 82 websites that were spreading COVID misinformation. And these 82 reached a peak of nearly 500 million Facebook views in the month of April 2020 alone. Now think about it. There was no shortage of high quality COVID information available to Facebook users that month of April. But Avaz found that the top 10 of those 82 websites drew 4 times as many views on Facebook, about 300 million, as did the websites of the top 10 leading health institutions, including the WHO and the CDC, who only got about 70 million. The extensive analysis concludes that Facebook's modest content moderation efforts were no match for its own operations of algorithmic amplification that favor provocative, high engagement content while ignoring its meaning, just as Bosworth described. So let's move on to the third way that the the final stage of the epistemic coup is displayed in the context of our pandemic. The pandemic created an opportunity for surveillance capitalism to build epistemic dominance, and it did this in large part by extending their presence in the domain of health data and body tracking. Now, this is coveted territory for these companies. It's a long game that is the focus of significant investment. As the Wall Street Journal put it recently, the healthcare industry represents, quote, the last bounty of personal data yet to be scooped up by technology companies, end quote. Now, when you dive into this data, as I have done for many, many months, what you see is that apps and wearables are key to their strategies. An Apple-led research study on wearables concluded the ubiquity and remarkable technological progress of wearables provides rich longitudinal information that can be mined for physiological and behavioral signatures. This is, of course, the context in which Google developed its determination to acquire Fitbit. The activity tracker was already praised by the CIA as early as 2013, where it noted that Fitbit data discloses gender, height, weight, provides also a 100% guarantee of identification from simply assessing a user's gait. That's G-A-I-T. Now, EU policymakers have asked Google for assurances that Fitbit data would not be used for targeting ads. That's a problem for two reasons. First of all, because Google's assurances cannot be trusted. And second of all, because targeted ads are not the relevant harm. The uses of these data move far beyond surveillance capitalism's origins in targeted ads. Indeed, Fitbit already markets itself to employers for the purposes of continuous employee monitoring, now with a special focus on COVID-19 symptoms, referred to as their, quote, ready for work package. The director of Google Health insists that the corporation's push into healthcare is motivated solely by the desire to make people healthy and doesn't want to sell them ads. But the Wall Street Journal, that great radical newspaper, reports an investigation of internal documents from Google's hospital deal with a large hospital network for whom they are collecting and analyzing data. And these documents reveal a whole new landscape of monetization opportunities for health data, including predicting procedures that patients might need and identifying opportunities for revenue in missed procedures and missed opportunities for treatment. In fact, the computational product, any computational product that reliably predicts the future of a person's health will be unimaginably lucrative. It will be sold to markets far beyond advertising, from insurers to employers, landlords, lenders, credit card companies, dating services, retailers. The list literally is endless. Finally, the pandemic offered Apple and Google a chance to test their epistemic dominance in a showdown with the EU and the democratically elected governments of its members. The two corporations were unabashed in wielding their private ownership of a primary global communications infrastructure to dictate terms to democratically elected officials and their public health authorities in the midst of the gravest public health emergency in a century. While many privacy advocates applauded their moves, I regard the spectacle of unaccountable instrumentarian power triumphing over democratic governments as a chilling forecast of the 21st century if the liberal democracies fail to mobilize for a digital future that is compatible with the aspirations of a democratic people. With that, let me talk for just a brief moment about our historical conditions right now, and then move on to a few brief ideas about some of the things that we can do in response to the epistemic coup. So I think it's pretty clear now that the questions of our digital future and our democratic future are inseparable. I have argued that this is not a story about technology or data. It's a story about law and institutions. So here's a thought experiment. Imagine it's December 31st, 1999, and you are looking back on a 20th century in which there were never laws to prohibit child labor or assert minimum wage standards, no workers' rights to join a union, strike, or bargain collectively, no consumer rights to safe drugs, safe food, safe products in every domain. No institutions to oversee everything from industrial relations to financial markets to environmental protection, no social safety nets. Instead, each company was left to decide for itself what rights would it recognize, what policies and practices would it employ, how would its profits be distributed. The result? The glories of our public sphere never came to be. Only a dark, dusty century of oligarchy and serfdom. But these rights, laws, and institutions did exist. In Europe, much of this work began in the late 19th century. In the US, it was a slow process, which was accomplished, a great deal of it was accomplished, actually during the third and fourth decades of the 20th century. But all of it was done to ensure that industrial capitalism lived under the rule of law, tethered to democratic principles and governance. These century-old creations, as important as they still are for our societies, do not protect us from the unprecedented effects of the epistemic coup that has been set into motion. And as a result, we march naked into the third decade of the digital century without the charters of rights, the legal frameworks, and the new institutional forms necessary to ensure a digital future that is compatible with democracy, that advances democracy. Now look, this failure is amplified in the global context because since at least 2010, the Chinese state has evolved a highly intentional theory and practice of digital design and deployment that advances their own form of authoritarian government and anchors both their domestic and foreign policies. As you know, the liberal democracies have failed to do the same. And this failure has left a void, and that void has been filled by the unaccountable power of surveillance capitalism. We have yet to fashion the vision, the laws, the policies, the institutions that advance our digital democratic future. I do not mean this as a pronouncement of doom, but I do mean it as a call to action. We are about to embark on the third decade of our digital century. We must undertake the same kind of creativity and courage, construction that our distant colleagues undertook over a century ago and a century ago. Europe has the advantage here, friends. You are the frontier. So, in conclusion, let's talk about some principles that will help guide us into this new decade. First of all, let's start with some principles that we can draw from the Fitbit example. Any notion of approving the Fitbit acquisition based on Google's promises not to do something that is anyway an irrelevant thing to do or not to do is a serious mistake. Such a decision should be reconsidered immediately and never again repeated. The two principles there are that if ever there was a case of trust but verify, that's the relationship that must be maintained with the surveillance capitalists. Secondly, we have to keep in mind, so often we reduce the harms back to that originating context of targeted advertising, when in fact, this whole economic logic has moved way beyond targeted advertising to many other markets. Second, if the decision to approve Google's acquisition of Fitbit was made because of a determination that European Union laws are not strong enough to defend the acquisition's denial in the European courts, then let us please stop talking right this minute. Let's suspend our event while the Parliament moves into an emergency session to pass new laws that are strong enough to take this kind of rejection through the courts, because we need those laws. Luckily, coming to a third point, you, EU parliamentarians, are about to inherit the legal instrument to accomplish this necessary lawmaking in the Digital Markets Act. Make no mistake, this is your opportunity to make a bold intervention to defend democracy against the surveillance capitalists. Faint-heartedness is not an option. Fourth, the Parliament's job is not completed with the Digital Markets Act. The Digital Services Act is also coming before you. This is your chance to finally pry open the black box of surveillance capitalism and demand the right of democratic societies to control their own destiny. The watchword here is audit authority. Democracy must have comprehensive audit authority to protect the public, just as you have done with countless other industries, from pharmaceuticals to financial services, natural resources extraction, just to name a few. And fifth, until now, most of our focus has been on data protection. If I return to my opening metaphor, the focus on data is comparable to arguing about oil once it's already out of the ground, when what we really want to do is ensure that oil remains in the ground. In other words, I am suggesting that we need to move upstream from data and focus instead on extraction itself, the operations that fill surveillance capitalism supply chains. An effective response to the epistemic coup begins with a formal recognition of epistemic rights. We have reached the point in the material development of information civilization when once elemental epistemic rights need to be codified in law. Especially, we need lawful boundaries of individual sovereignty over personal experience. Rights-based constraints on the continuous and omnivorous collection of human-generated data would alter the foundations of the surveillance economy, undercutting essential institutional mechanisms such as extraction and targeting. Conversations that begin with negotiations over data have already forfeited these rights. We don't negotiate over how many hours a day a child can work in a factory we outlaw child labor, we must do the same when it comes to illegitimate data that should not exist in the first place, certainly without the citizens' agreement, consent, and rights to how it is shared and to what purposes it is put. And finally, on the demand side, I want to talk about interrupting and outlawing the very markets that trade in human futures. And this would eliminate financial incentives for the illegitimate data extraction and the concentrations of knowledge and power that are produced, as we have seen, in the competition to sell certainty, the competition for the best prediction products, the highest degree of certainty, which is essentially the financial incentives that make these markets tick. This competition, as we have seen, reliably produces destructive consequences for people and for democracy. Democratic societies have outlawed other markets that produce reliably dangerous and anti-democratic consequences. Markets that trade in human beings were outlawed, even when they supported whole economies. We outlaw markets that trade in human organs because they threaten and degrade individuals in society. To conclude, perhaps some of my suggestions strike you as impossible or impossibly idealistic. If so, I would humbly suggest that our sense of the possible is constrained by the acid bath of habituation and normalization that has characterized these last 2 decades. Can we even recall those feelings of indignation and dismay that accompanied our virgin realization of the hidden tracking and monitoring that quickly became our conditions of existence? To resurrect those virgin responses, I suggest you discuss these matters with a child, because children are not yet resigned to the normalization of the abnormal, nor are they tolerant of the intolerable. And so in closing, I return to my friend, Iasonos Kritikos, and his elemental wisdom of the spirit. I'm going to quote now from Iasonos, who wrote in his project about surveillance capitalism. My grandpa tells me that computers decide about us without asking us. I think that's unfair because my parents always ask me for my opinion. I don't understand why we should allow these small machines to tell us how to live. That is so strange to me. If there were computers in ancient Athens, I think that the demos would not allow these devices to tell us what to do and what is true. I think that Ms. Zuboff has a very difficult job to do if she wants to change the world, because she fights against invisible and strange creatures, as the ancient Iasonos once did. I think I can help her. I think I can help her with this, but I need to grow a bit taller first. We all need to grow a bit taller. We all need to reach a bit further, because the work of this century now falls to us. The world looks to Europe. I look to Europe. I look to you. Most importantly, Iasonos looks to you, because you are the frontier, my friends. You are the frontier in this existential struggle for the soul of our information civilization. Once again, we are called upon to roll up our sleeves. Welcome to the 3rd decade. And thank you.
Susanna, that was really an inspiring speech. I am taking notes constantly of what you've been talking about. Your analysis of the problematic aspects of digital economy reminds us we have a lot of work to do, actually. And I want to thank you, if I could do that on behalf of Europe, for calling on us to take this responsibility, because I understand Europe could be a global rule setter for the internet. I know you also appreciate our Vice President Vestager for her work, and I believe if we join forces, we could achieve so much more, and we should not compromise. I already have very interesting questions for the issues that you raised. If we should outlaw business models, or if we should try to make sure that assurances can be trusted. But before that, I have with me two experts that I would like to give them the floor for some remarks to reflect on your initial keynote speech. And for 5 minutes each, Fredrik Heinz, Associate Professor of Computer Science in Sweden, and he has also been a member of the high-level expert group, both of them have actually, of the European Commission, and he's working and focusing on autonomous systems and software and artificial intelligence, of course, and integrated systems, and also the intersection between knowledge representation and machine learning. The CVs of our panelists are online, and they're posted in the event's webpage, because you have succeeded so much that I cannot mention everything. So I give you first the floor, and then I will give the floor to Karen. Thank you, Fredrik.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. And of course, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation and speech. And I really think, I really agree on this, that we are in this kind of crossroads where we need to take the steps to ensure that we have this digital future that really enhances our democratic society, as was said. And actually, I think that Europe has taken a clear and ambitious path towards this through this ethical guidelines for trustworthy AI that we have then been developing in this high-level expert group. And I do think that these are absolutely essential to protect our fundamental human rights and our democratic society. So, the principles that we include there is, for example, the right to autonomy, and that, we as humans should not be replaced, but we should be complemented and empowered to be able to leverage this society and these opportunities. And also the right to, fairness, explicability, and so on are other key principles in this. However, of course, the real challenge is how do we go from these principles to concrete results? And we have taken a few steps there with this defining a number of requirements, and also this assessment list for how do you assess whether you're actually living up to these requirements. So I think we have taken a number of steps, and of course there are many steps more need to be taken. I also wanted to address this epistemic inequality, which I think is a very interesting, and of course very challenging aspect of this, that the amount of information and knowledge both about us and what we have is really unequal. And that I think in order to have a broad and inclusive discussion about AI that is actually based on fact and understanding, I really think we also need to invest in educating the general population about this kind of digitalization, AI, and so on, so that people understand the consequences and the kind of, both the risks and opportunities of this. So I really think that is another key area that we should invest in education, and not only of the kind of technical experts to the kind of engineers. And I would like to say that engineers are also people. But of course that we need to broaden this understanding to more people. And in the last step, I also think what's important is to engage a broad part of society in these discussions about what kind of digital future do we want? What do I as a citizen want and expect from these systems? And I really think that it will fall back to this issue of trust. How can I, as a regular citizen or regular person living in Europe, for example, how can I trust these systems so that I feel comfortable using them and feel comfortable that my rights will not be violated, but I can go on with my everyday life as I want. So thank you very much for now.
Thank you, Frederick, for highlighting very important topics and for all your work at the high-level expert group. It was really important to start with an ethical framework in Europe. And you were joined by Karen Jung. Karen has been a professor of law, ethics, and informatics in Birmingham, and herself, as I said, participated and focusing on the legal, ethical, social, and democratic implications of big data analytics, artificial intelligence, DLT, and robotics. So I think talking also about governance and regulation that you're focusing on, Karen, would be very useful to listen also to your reflections in this speech. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Eva. It's a real privilege to be here. Hopefully, can you hear me? Can you just give me a little thumbs up? Thank you. Firstly, can I just say thank you to Professor Zuboff for an inspirational talk. I have to confess that I read your paper in 2015 and it blew my mind. It really articulated a number of things that had been worrying me for a couple of years, and I felt like you cut through all the BS and absolutely nailed what was going on. And I really want to thank you for the incredibly important call to arms that I think you have issued. I also see Europe as the last hope that we have in what I see also as the battle for the soul of democracy. And I also feel absolutely about the fundamental importance of law, of institutions, and above all, for the rule of law over and above the rule of technological power. That knowledge is power, and if we do not constrain it, we are in serious trouble. People think I'm a nut, but I think if you really look at where the direction is heading of all of these things, it is looking like an unstoppable train unless, as you say, we have the collective will and the legal institution, the courage to do something about it. And so enforceable legal institutions that will safeguard our fundamental democratic freedoms. And in this respect, I guess one of the things that has really bothered me over the last couple of years, and the great work that the high-level expert group did in terms of producing guidelines for trustworthy AI, is the way in which so much of the discussion is still framed in terms of ethics. Let's do the right thing. And I have no problem with ethics. I think it's great that we should do the right thing, but it is not enough. We need practically enforced institutions. There, I think, lies the challenge. I think that also one thing that's really novel about the dynamics of capitalism is the capacity to operate at scale in a cumulative, aggregate way very quickly, actually has this capacity to undermine this, what I call the social foundations of democracy. So the fact that we enjoy individual freedom presupposes a certain social exercise is that in rights, which I think of a really important foundation for protection, needs to take account of the in an aggregate way. I guess is a little bit like the irrelevant commons. So often difficult to perceive, but when it's gone and almost impossible to rebuild. And so that really worries me. And I'm struggling to think of a way institutionally to protect that. So I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts about how do we protect the social foundations of democratic freedom from the aggregate cumulative effects of behavioural surveillance of the kind that you speak so well of. And I guess one of the things that I feel constantly troubled by is what I call the kind of digital enchantment, that there is still, including in Europe, an obsession, and I'm going to call it an obsession, with innovation will save us. Particularly, and we see this in COVID, all of the digital apps that came out, basically they were going to save us. They did no such thing. There was a lot of energy and investment in trying to identify who was talking to who and whose body went where. Did they protect us? No, they did not. And the evidence shows that they did no such thing. So one of the things that concerns me is, given the kind of economic situation that states find themselves in, and which has been drastically exacerbated from the pandemic, is how do we push back against this unthinking worship at the altar of innovation? Because innovation, to the extent that it produces socially welfare enhancing services, is all to be celebrated, but not all innovation serves society. So I really want to know, I'd be really interested in knowing, Professor Zuboff, how you would respond to that. And how you do respond to that, and how you think Europe should respond to this. And of course, it's in the interests of the surveillance capitalists to really big up this romantic fascination with innovation, and particularly data-driven innovation, because that is seen as the savior of our economic woes. And this is very, very difficult to combat. So I'd be really interested, I guess, in hearing your response to combating that enchantment. Thank you very much. That's enough from me.
Thank you, Karen. So, Shoshana, if I may, let me open also the floor to public debate. I'm receiving already questions. My colleagues are also participating, MEPs, members from the European Parliament, so they are free now to use the WebEx to table the question. But I already have some questions from the Deputy Director General, Ursula Packel, from the European Consumers Office organization, and also from Diego Tulli from Google, and Mr. Manichari is a professor of robotics in Polytechnic School of France, Cyrus Hodge from IEEE, Mr. Bugin from McKinsey, Gianna Martinengo and Jeff Mulgan and Ernst Eckehart from ILO. These are members of our International Advisory Board, and I will try to merge a bit their questions, and so after Karen's and Frederick comments that you can respond to, I would like also to add, because you mentioned thinking to outlaw business models, the question is how we can protect consumers. Should we outlaw? Should we consider maybe other ways to create assurances and a trusted environment for the data that we produce through shopping online, through social media, because, so Diego from Google is mentioning, micro-targeted advertisement has also improved access to information for users. And open internet is funded by targeted advertisement mainly. So could we see it on the other side of the mirror as a fuel of democratic participation, or should we outlaw models like that? So is there maybe another shade of a response? So Shoshana, thank you again, and I will keep asking you questions. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Eva, and thank you, Frederick, and thank you, Karen. It's a pleasure to meet you both. And Karen, I also read your paper, and I saw how you put the concept of big other to such brilliant use. And I felt very proud of that. And it was a great paper. I think I cited it in the book, in fact. So admirer of both of your work. And I think the question that you're raising, Eva, if I understand it correctly, I think it does actually speak very much to the question that Karen was raising about innovation. So here's the thing. It's kind of astonishing when you think about it. And I think about it all the time, and I still feel astonished when I think about it, that the vast majority of what we're talking about, the discovery of behavioral surplus, the idea of claiming private human experience as free raw material for the next era of economic commodification, these actions, these processes, these operations have had extraordinary effects. And I've just spent probably a little bit longer than I had been supposed to spend describing them to you. But when you consider that all of that was done for the sake of advertising, for me, there's a disconnect, the kind of disconnect between, the sacred and the profane, if you will. It's that kind of disconnect. Is it right that we have created these empires that are on a collision course with democracy, both because of the way in which at the grassroots they undermine human autonomy, and because of the way structurally they create these huge concentrations which are fundamentally inimical to democracy and its values for the sake of advertising? So now let me let me park that question right there and come back to innovation. Because the extraordinary thing is that the research that we're seeing now suggests that there hardly is any innovation in this sector. That in fact, innovators pop up in this sector. They are purchased by the big companies, and innovation sort of gets, swept into this black hole. And the pace of innovation, the kind of innovation that's really adding to GDP, is not coming out of these sectors, of these hyperscale companies. So where is the innovation? Well, from a whole different point of view, I would argue that the innovation is in my inbox. Because what's in my inbox every day, there are at least 20 young entrepreneurs who are saying, I have an idea for this in health, or I have an idea for this in education, or I have an idea for this in climate, or whatever. But all of it's digital, and none of it includes surveillance capitalism. But I can't attract the kind of investors I need, because everyone is looking for that surveillance payoff, what I call the surveillance dividend, where you're making money on the data that you scrape from the people that use your stuff. Whether you're the ovulation tracker or whether you're the dishwasher, the way you're making money is not from your service or your app or your device or even your, your piece of white goods. Those now are loss leaders for the purposes of collecting data for monetization. And unless you're willing to participate in the surveillance model, it's just so hard to get into the game. So let's put these two ideas together and let's say we want innovation. We want data. We want data that's going to finally actually meet the needs of real people. We want data that is going to meet the central crises of our society. Data that's going to accrue to the climate crisis, data that's going to accrue to solving all kinds of diseases. We want data for us, for our purposes. That's not what we've got now. These huge knowledge concentrations are from us and they're about us, but they're not for us. They accrue to others' ends. So the idea that we would outlaw micro-targeted behavioral advertising, that is not a radical idea. All that says is, in the GDPR, there's something called purpose limitation. The idea that you only use the data for that one thing that I got online to do, or the one thing I'm doing in my life. Like, I want to drive my car and go to the store. I don't want to be streaming data to you. Purpose limitation. You only get to use data to actually help me drive my car. And if I don't need the data to help me drive my car, you shouldn't be collecting it. It shouldn't even exist. Purpose limitation is where we began in the data revolution. That's the good stuff. Let's use data for the purposes that we choose. We never chose targeted online advertising. And of course, now other new research also suggesting that, the economics of that, which have certainly accrued to the great surveillance capitalists, and especially the duopoly of Google and Facebook, looks like those economics are not actually being shared in a way that we would call fair by the publishers. And also, let's not forget to mention, and then I will stop talking, that another price that we paid for this advertising juggernaut is the destruction of the newspaper industry, which is an institution that is mission critical to democracy. And it is because of that destruction, for the sake of targeted advertising and building these duopolies, that we are in the pickle that we're in when we talk about the second phase of the epistemic coup and epistemic chaos that is opening the door and laying out the red carpet to autocrats all over the world at a rate that we have not seen since for many, many decades. So let's not mourn targeted advertising. It's part of the problem, not part of the solution.
Susanna, that's very interesting, because we are actually planning to have legislation in 21 and make sure that there will be awareness of how the companies collect data, use them, store them, and transfer them from service to service under the same big companies, so especially for the gatekeepers. Of course, we face resistance, and I understand that also basing your business model there, but offering free services to citizens is an exchange that a lot of people are willing to do and have. So they're exchanging their data, and they have a personalized experience, they have targeted advertisements, but sometimes if they have irrelevant content, they feel that something is wrong with their internet. So they're used to that. And as you said, they outsource the trust to the system to suggest what is the best choice for them. So we start to trust the engines more than we trust ourselves. And this is a very thin line to cross. So my question would be, and it comes out of the members I mentioned, do you think that Europe could act as a global rules setter? And do you believe we can collaborate with US? How do you feel our relation is at this point? And or do you think we should start discussing about private internet, protected internet, in order to have sovereignty under our own rules and protect our GDPR responsibilities from the ones that they don't want to follow the same principles? Yes.
Oh, sorry. There was one word I couldn't pick up in the first part of the question, and that was, do you think Europe could become? And then I couldn't. A global
rule setter to set the rules for the internet, like a GDPR that would be setting rules and also by law binding to everybody that collaborates or enters the European single market?
Well, not only do I think the EU can become a global rule setter, I think the EU must become a global rule setter. And my language for that would be a global leader. You see, the place that we're in, and that's why I try to frame it as our historical conditions. The place that we're in is that, and I want to be very sure not to in any way belittle the magnificent foundation that GDPR has laid for all of us, and the incredible work that went into that effort. At the time, maybe some folks thought that that was going to be the beginning, the middle, and the end. It turns out to be, a foundation that we have to keep building on, because there's so much that has to be done to even test the propositions of the GDPR. But the situation that we're in is that, and that's why I began with 9/11. I began with this, a little glimpse into the birth story of surveillance capitalism. This economic logic has been allowed to root and flourish for 2 decades, essentially without impediment. That's an extraordinary thing. That takes us back to the Gilded Age and the Goulds, and the great robber barons. We didn't call them robbers at the time. We called them barons, and later we look back and we started calling them robbers, because we understood how recklessly they extracted from society without giving back. And and the verbiage that they used at the time to argue with the lawmakers of their day was, they said, if you try to interfere with us, you will damage American prosperity and you will end our ability to innovate. So it's useful to know that the rhetoric you're hearing today has literally been recycled from the Gilded Age, the very same things that those men said at every election time, when they wanted to make sure that nobody was going to be elected who was going to try to regulate them or create laws, as Karen says. So, so to be a leader now is not to be, some kind of radical, overbearing regulator. To be a leader now is to say democracy can no longer be a bystander. Democracy can no longer sleepwalk through this epistemic revolution that is altering all of our institutions, all of our rights, without our even having codified what's going on and what we need to keep our societies on a track that will allow democracy to flourish and allow the kind of individual freedoms and individual rights that that we have not only inherited, but each generation has the responsibility to expand upon. So, can we be the rule setter? Yes. But more importantly, can we be the leader? Can we be the beacon? Can we turn the lights on that will illuminate the path for everyone in every country on Earth? We're all looking to you. Now, as far as the alliance with the US, it is my greatest hope that the Biden administration, in its wisdom and with its great values and in its allegiance to democracy, will understand that we are at a critical turning point in this 3rd decade. If we don't start to turn this around and reintroduce law and institutions and rights into this landscape, losing another decade is going to put us in a very difficult situation. The way back after another decade is going to be far more difficult than it is today. So it is my great hope that there will be connections to be made and collaborations to be had. And there won't be agreement on every point because there is a lag. I mean, not everybody in the US conversation is where you are, but there will be points of agreement. And that's what we have to find, and that's what we have to build on. And eventually, it is my hope that the US and key actors, both within this administration and allies of the administration, will be able to also build a leadership position that participates with you, if not in every single initiative, in the spirit and the practice of a great deal.
You have a very passionate voice, and I'm happy that you have such high expectations also from Europe, and we are struggling to get there and overcome our shortcomings. The question that I usually receive, and I have received it already now for you, addressed to you, is how do you think we can achieve this sovereignty? I wouldn't say of Europe now, I would say of democracies, and at the same time be able to compete with big markets like China, one of the top 3, and maybe rapidly increasing to be the top 1 because of the immense access to data. Since they don't respect privacy, they have a different mentalities. So how can we achieve both?
You know, this is such an interesting question, and I'm glad it was asked. What I see in the US is that the issue of we have to compete with China is asked and answered by the surveillance capitalists, as you might expect. They regard it as an urgent issue, but their answers to the question, how do we compete with China? Their answers are essentially, we become more like China. In other words, we develop the facial recognition systems, and we develop the vocal recognition systems, and we develop the sensors and the cameras and the internet-enabled everything that's collecting data from everywhere. And since we disdain regulation, we prefer the idea of ethical AI, and we prefer the idea of self-regulation, and we'll just make sure, because we're nice people, that all of this will be used nicely. The idea that we compete with China by becoming more like China, to me, is a pernicious idea. People around the world are yearning for an alternative to a surveillance-based internet, a surveillance-based digital milieu. And there's no one right now to supply it. I believe that a democratic a design and deployment that employs principles that are consistent with democracy for the way we do e-commerce, for the way we do telehealth, for the way we do remote education, for the way we do social media, that there is such latent demand for these kinds of opportunities in Europe, in the United States, and literally in every country on earth, that these new players will be overwhelmed with demand. They will become successful, they will become wealthy, and they will be doing it the way capitalism has always done it, by aligning supply and demand, by actually meeting the real needs of people, and by doing it in a way that really solves individual and societal problems. That may seem like some kind of Pollyanna statement, but in fact, it is not. It is what has allowed capitalism to evolve for these many centuries. And I'm not a capitalist apologist. If we evolve into a different kind of more just economic system, that's fantastic. Right now, we have some urgent problems, and I'd be satisfied at least with a capitalism that is operating as it must operate, which is under the rule of law, under democratic governance, tethered to democratic institutions, and therefore with these close linkages and reciprocities with its own society, where it's actually meeting the real needs of people. Surveillance capitalism is a massive market failure because it is supplying exactly what people do not want. Anytime people learn about the methods and mechanisms of surveillance capitalism, they reject it. They want to hide. They want to be camouflaged. They want to extract themselves. They're looking for other alternatives. But what's happened, especially over this last decade, is that there are no other alternatives. We live under the dictatorship of no alternatives. We are all forced to march through these supply chains in every walk of life. Our car, calling the school for our kids' grades, going to the doctor's office, or now doing telehealth, whatever it is, going shopping, making plans for dinner on social media. We're marching through their supply chains and they're taking what they want. So we have an opportunity to break this open for real competition, for a healthy capitalism that reinstates its natural reciprocities with democracy and with the people it serves and with its communities. Right now, whatever you want to say about these big companies, have you ever had a problem? Do you call their customer service number? I mean, you can call a customer service number at Amazon, it's true. And if you talk to a few robots, eventually you can talk to a person. And they do a great job, which is why they got wealthy before they started to be surveillance capitalists. But you can't call Google and you can't call Facebook. These are fundamentally non-public facing. And I guess the final thing I'll say is that one of the questions mentioned the idea of free services. And I think this is overblown for at least two reasons. I'll just mention two. One is that there are so many competitors waiting to do the things that these companies have done, but to do them without the anti-democratic and anti-human externalities. That I think we will have plenty of options for these services, and they'll have all different kinds of models, and some will be subscription and some may not, so on and so forth. But the other thing is, it's really hard to find anybody on Earth right now who, or at least until very recently, at least until the smartphone, anybody who didn't have a phone in their house. So, I mean, we've all had, phone service all of our lives, and we're paying a monthly phone bill. It wasn't that big a deal. And there were plenty of companies that had progressive billing for their phone bills based on how much you used it or whatever. So the idea that, that the freeness of this service is the sine qua non that legitimates everything else that goes with it. Today, so many people have smartphones, and those phones are expensive. And many people are paying for data, and they're paying for other services on those phones, and they're paying. So, I mean, people are paying. And now, of course, you're buying products that are internet enabled, that are part of surveillance capitalism, and you're certainly paying for those products. You're buying television sets, you're buying dishwashers, you're buying streaming services, you're paying for surveillance capitalism anyway in a whole range of things. The real thing about free and why they want to defend free, the real thing that is free on these platforms is us. we are free. We are free to them. We're paying in all kinds of ways, but they are not paying. Our lives are free raw material for them. Our voices are free to them. My face is free to them. They're the ones who are getting it all for free. Let's work on stopping that.
I would maybe add that we are actually cheap because we have access to the services, and this is enough, but we don't consider that we don't have the options to control our data or what's happening after we use one service. So I think we have a great responsibility to create more options, as you mentioned before, and alternatives for citizens that they are aware of what is happening with their data, and they still would love, of course, to use the public good of having internet and open internet and services. I have some questions, but I know we're running out of time. I will try to mention some of those, and you can choose if you want to, if you would like to answer.
Okay.
So one question from a colleague, Ms. Galvez, would be if we could tame surveillance capitalism in a democratic way, if mainstreaming economics is still the main narrative. And then a second from IEEE director is if legislators could join forces with technologies, we should trust companies to introduce rules to penalize the sale of children's data. Maybe that would be actually a good start. And then if we can find ways to guarantee that social media will remain a place of respect. And here maybe I would add a final question. We try to impose some rules for political targeted advertisement, and then we gave this huge power, the tremendous power to the social media to control content. So instead of having this in our hands, we allow them to control content. And I was wondering if you see if there should be any differentiation between political targeted advertisements or in general micro-targeting for any advertisements for consumers. I would ask this question, I would end by saying that during the pandemic, people felt that they preferred to be safe than private. And they were kind of forced or trusted to use contact tracing applications. And hopefully, because we have these fundamental rights that the European Union is based in, they are not being used to discriminate them or to exclude them. But actually, we cannot audit constantly the systems and the companies that use these applications, that they own these applications. So it's not very easy to convince citizens that they can be safe and they can have their privacy. And then, as Elena said, like, is there a democratic way to do so? So, Susanna, these are our final questions.
Okay, well, let's start with this last one because this is so important. The idea that so many people in so many societies, when the pandemic hit, apart from the fact that, and it's worth stating that if you were reading, the medical journals and if you were reading the early accounts, everybody who was actually following contact tracing understood that these automated systems, these phone-based applications, were not going to be an important solution. This was clear from the beginning. It was in the Journal of American Medicine, it was in the Lancet, all of the studies, all the people who understood epidemiology were saying this. So in a way, it was a kind of theater, the Google and Apple, Google contact tracing. It was a theater that was an opportunity to make some larger points, which is what I suggested in my talk. But the idea that anyone feels that privacy is at odds with safety, this is a tragedy of our moment. But we've already discussed the origins of this tragedy. This is the tragedy that results from 2 decades in which surveillance capitalism was allowed to root and flourish because there's no trusting the private side. and B, 2 decades that they were allowed to root and flourish because our governments told them it was okay. The United States government was not the only government that wanted the data to connect the dots after 9/11. The European governments, the Five Eyes, right? There were governments all over the world who were part of that, part of that coalition. And not because they were, bad or had nefarious objectives, because they were patriots and because they were frightened by what happened, because they felt they had failed as intelligence officers, and they wanted to protect our countries and our people. So, at the beginning, there were honest reasons for this, but all of our governments compromise themselves by supporting this thing right in the beginning, not realizing that 20 years later, we would have created these behemoths, these surveillance empires that now dwarf our governments, that have these concentrations of knowledge and power beyond anything that we'd ever imagine, truly unprecedented, and now a threat to the very governments that gave them birth. So when I talk about historical conditions and the fact that we need new charters of rights, new laws, and new institutions, we need that, and we need that now. And when we have that, we can feel safe, no longer naked. We can feel safe that I can trust my government through the Public Health Authority, which is an institution that resides under the rule of law in a democratic society, with firm rules and firm laws that lay out, the rules of the road for all of these data flows and uses and purposes and sovereignty and so forth. I have epistemic rights so that things can't happen without my agreement in a truly meaningful way. And there's individual sovereignty, and there are laws, and there's oversight by democratic institutions. We put that in place, and this idea of a binary relationship between safety and trust, that just evaporates. This is exactly the problem we have to solve. And if we had solved it already, the companies would not have been able to assert epistemic hegemony, epistemic dominance on our governments, because the citizens and the institutions would be united, as we have been in the past, by the way, not a pipe dream. We have gone through much of our histories being united, our democratic institutions and our citizens, literally on the same page. So with high levels of trust. So let's resurrect that, but let's do it for the 21st century, for the digital century. Goodness knows we've done it before, and we can certainly do it again.
I'm really listening that, and I agree that we have a choice, and we have to decide how we want to move to the future. And this is something we should now control, that we can. And we have this ability before superintelligence or autonomy leaves humans and enters a different revolution, the superintelligence, where autonomy will be there, and we will not have the capacity to understand this new intelligence. I believe that your next book would be something with the biotech, or the right to our neurons, and how we can control our body, and how we can keep our autonomy, or maybe not, because you have the foresight to understand what's coming next and where we should focus on. But for us, really, it's important to keep having a connection with you. So I would love to invite you again to join the advisory board of the Science and Technology panel of the European Parliament. We are collaborating with OECD, so we're trying to follow your suggestions and have global organizations collaborating into finding common standards and principles to agree on. I know OECD invited you, Anthony Guccia, created an observatory for artificial intelligence among parliamentarians, basically all over the world. And we're trying to regulate beyond the EU, not just from EU. So hopefully we will manage to raise your expectations. And I would love to invite you to present your book, this one or the next one, to the European Parliament in Brussels when it will be possible to fly again, or Greece as my guest and as STOA guest. And because your insightful and passionate voice, Josiana, is really needed for us to help us and set rules on algorithmic transparency, to create a trusted environment and shape the digital age to be inclusive and responsible. And I believe this is the best time to do that. And you actually give us hope, because you remind us that we have the decision to make and the choice in our hands, and also, as I said, homework. So I personally hope you will remain close to these efforts. You're a world-class thinker, and as I said, a role model to me and many of us. And I want to thank Frederick and Karen for being with us. And I believe we could have you also for other discussions, because now we are expecting really legislation to come in our hands in March for an ethical framework that will be binding by law. We are expecting the Data Governance Act to come to us. This means we will try to make sure that there will be access to some data, but protection to data that are of higher risk, like our health data. And we will try, as you mentioned, to translate the laws, translate human rights, I would say, to digital human rights in a way that there will be no exclusion, there will be no discrimination, and citizens will still have options, the right to privacy, the right to redress. It's not easy to do, but with people like all of you, we managed to, I think, move fast forward under this prism of the pandemic. So I don't know if you have any last words for us. Yes?
Well, you know, I first of all, I am devoted to your cause, and I am committed to being help in any one of these activities should you call upon me. So this to me is the frontier. I say it passionately, but I also mean it with deadly seriousness. You are the frontier. You have the opportunity now for the breakthrough leadership that the whole world is waiting for and desperately, desperately wants. And so if I can be of any help, you call on me. And I will remind you of something, a passage that I read in reading Hannah Arendt once that is worth remembering. She was at an academic symposium, stuffy things that they are, and she was criticized. Her language was criticized for being too passionate and bringing her indignation toward the phenomenon of totalitarianism, bringing that indignation into her way of describing the phenomenon. And her response, in fact, I think I might actually have it here that I could read to you, because I was using it the other day. Her response is something that is very, very, very important. She said, in response to this stuffy old academic who told her she was being to bringing her values into her description. She said, if I describe these conditions, without permitting my indignation to interfere, then I have lifted this particular phenomenon out of its context in human society. And I have thereby robbed it of the most important part of its nature, deprived it of its most important inherent qualities. And I think that is something that we share, Eva and all of those who are listening today. We share the sense of indignity because we are in the face of a great power that degrades the human spirit, that degrades human autonomy, that degrades democracy, that lords its power over society in a way that is very unhelpful. So let us celebrate our indignity and our passion, and let that feed our reason and our authority and our creativity and our ability to work together to build this future that we need. It's going to take all of us. It's going to take every single one of us. So you have my collaboration, and I look forward to yours. Thank you so much.
I don't think I should add anything to that. I want to thank you again, deep from my heart, because we had a great participation, which means that actually people want to listen, they are concerned and they care. And we have a huge responsibility to take your recommendations and your voice and do something about it, more than expected, I would suggest. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We have more than 300, 400 participants and thousands that are registering to watch online, because it's going to be web stream and stay online in our STOA website. And I wish you to stay safe and healthy till we meet again, as promised. And
I can't wait until we can meet in the room together, my friend. In the room together, you and all of our audience in the room together, feeling each other's feelings and driving these ideas to their next level.
Because the physical distance is actually what separates us, the creativity and the emotional intelligence, from anything else we've been discussing. Susanna, it's been an honor to have you.
Thank you, Eva.
Thank you again. I want to thank STOA. I want to thank Frederick Haynes, Karen Jung, and our Vice President, Margarita Skinas. And all of you again, until we meet, stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you for staying actually a bit longer than expected.
My great pleasure. Thank you so much. It's been an honor.